The warrior ability Bladestorm has its roots in Warcraft 3 with the Blademaster class, where their ultimate ability was Bladestorm and worked in a very similar way to how it did in WoW. It made the unit spin around for around 7 seconds, dealing AoE damage, and made the Blademaster immune to spells while under the effect. Bladestorm was first added to WoW in Wrath of the Lich King as the final talent in the ARMS warrior tree. And in its WoW version, it did basically the same thing. You instantly whirlwind all nearby targets for the next 6 seconds, performing 1 whirlwind every second, and while under the effects of Bladestorm, you can move but cannot perform any other attacks or abilities on a 1.5 minute cooldown. And at the end of the tooltip, there was a little bit of flavor stating, "But you do not feel pity or remorse or fear and cannot be stopped unless killed," which was a reference to the original Terminator movie from 1984. A reference shared by the Bestial Wrath ability that hunters had. Basically, as a holdover from Warcraft 3, its ability also made you immune to things, but only CC effects instead of all spells and their damage. Bestial Wrath also made you immune to CC while it was active, except Bestial Wrath allowed you to use the ability while you were under the effects of a CC in order to actually break the effect, and then makes you immune to them for the next 20 seconds. Bladestorm required you to be in control of your character in order to use it, and only lasted 6 seconds in comparison. But they were both excellent DPS cooldowns, as the original version of Bladestorm was functionally a single target nuke, and was legitimately something to be feared. Especially in Wrath of the Lich King, which had the armor penetration stat, where with heavy stacking of the stat and an on-use armor pen trinket, you could melt low armor classes within that 6 seconds of the Bladestorm pretty easily, to the point where people were very afraid when a warrior Bladestormed on them, especially since it was technically an AoE and could kill multiple people if they were stacked up, and especially when sweeping strikes used to work with it, and allowed it to cleave and basically double up on its AoE damage. There was technically a Bladestorm-like effect in the game as far back as vanilla, with the Ravager Axe from the Scarlet Monastery, but that was a proc effect and should not be confused with this ability. In patch 303, Blizzard added in that when it was activated, Bladestorm would remove all roots and snares, since for some reason it didn't do that already, and also made it one of the few abilities in the game that allows you to remove a daze effect that can be applied for a mob hitting you from behind. And in patch 3.1, they added in the Glyph of Bladestorm, which would simply reduce the cooldown of it by 15 seconds. The final change of the ability in Wrath came in patch 333, making it so warriors could now be disarmed during Bladestorm, effectively rendering the ability useless, making the Terminator line reference in the ability a total lie, since it was no longer accurate. They now could be stopped if they were disarmed instead of just killed. And since most disarm effects of Wrath of the Lich King had a 1 minute cooldown, and Bladestorm had a 1.5 minute cooldown baseline, this was actually a huge blow to the ability overall. It basically meant anyone with a disarm could just save it for when the warrior was popping their big cooldown, and completely negate it, which included a rogue's dismantle, priests with their psychic horror ability, other warriors with their disarm, and hunters with their Scorpion Sting Chimera Shot combo. Moving on to the Cataclysm, Bladestorm was reworked a bit, to where it would now instantly strike all nearby targets within range with your weapon attack, then perform a whirlwind attack every second for 6 seconds. That was not quite what was advertised, as it was hotfixed a couple months after launch, as it seemed they were intended was that you would deal 150% weapon damage every tick, rather than just normal 100% weapon damage, which it had been up to this point. And then about halfway through the expansion, it got another hotfix, which ensured that it would always grant immunity when you cast it, because in some situations it just wouldn't for some reason. Not super important. Anyways, we move on to Mist of Pandaria, where it had a little bit of a revamp, where it stopped being an ARMS warrior specific ability and became a level 60 talent for all specs. So to this end, it also had the weapon damage reduced from 150 down to 120, and warriors could now dodge, block, and parry, as well as use their shouts during Bladestorm. Also at this time, the tooltip was changed and the Terminator reference was removed. Then in patch 5.2, warriors were now fully immune to disarm effects during Bladestorm again. It was rather anticlimactic to use a big 1.5 minute cooldown to just get instantly disarmed and ruin it. And in some hotfixes and minor tweaks between the middle of Mist of Pandaria, the damage for Prot Warrior's Bladestorm was increased from the 120% weapon damage per tick all the way up to 240%, basically doubling it. Now, this increase was intended to be there to make it worthwhile on the tanking spec, because it was rather weak with one-handed weapons that most warriors would use in that spec. However, what some prot warriors did was just equip a two-handed weapon, and then use this super buffed Bladestorm to just destroy everyone in PvP, before they nerfed it so that it could no longer be a thing that you could do in that spec. It also had a couple of other changes to it later on in Mists of Pandaria, as in patch 5.4, its cooldown was reduced to just 1 minute, rather than the previous 1.5 minutes, and the damage values were reworked again. For arms, it went up from 120 to 180% weapon damage, and for protection, it went down from its really high 240% to just 160%. Although this change was relatively short-lived, as in Warlords of Draenor was right around the corner, and they were planning with messing with the values all over again. In Warlords of Draenor, Bladestorm switched places with Stormbolt in the talent tree, moving up to the level 90 row. Also, you could no longer use all your shouts during it, and instead could only use Demoralizing Shout, but you could still use taunts and self-sustains, like Enrage Regeneration, Shield Wall, and Last Stand. The damage values were also normalized again, so all the specs did 160% weapon damage, with the Fury version specifically noting that it did 160% of main hand damage as well as the same amount of offhand damage. The only other change to the ability came in a minor hotfix 2 weeks after patch 6.2.2, which fixed an animation issue for Dwarf Warriors. Legion had many changes in tuning passes for Bladestorm, as player power was reaching insane numbers. But setting that aside for a moment, the far more important change was to Bladestorm's animation. The Legion beta had a really funny animation where swords would constantly spin around you, reminiscent to the Rogue's Fan of Knives ability. To the relief of many warriors on the forums and comment sections across the internet, Blizzard settled on a much more suitable animation that is still used today. Now that we have the important stuff out of the way, onto some technical changes. Protection warriors could no longer use Bladestorm, and the Ravager talent, which was added back in Warlords of Draenor, would now replace Bladestorm for them. Arms warriors got the ability as a default option instead of a talent, and it continued to stay a talent for Fury warriors. Also, Bladestorm had its tooltip redesigned, so instead of saying the percentage of weapon damage per tick like it had in the past, it now said 1015% physical damage over 6 seconds. This would make it roughly 169 weapon damage every second for a total of 1015% of your weapon's damage during those 6 seconds. And on top of all these changes, it had its cooldown increased back up to 1.5 minute cooldown from the 1 minute it had been in Mists of Pandaria. Then, in an early patch in Legion, Bladestorm had a small damage increase, and also Arms Warriors now gained access to the ability at level 65, down from level 100, so they could use it earlier while leveling. At this time, it was also fixed so that it would deal full damage in PvP, as throughout the expansion it only dealt half damage in PvP, despite not actually saying so. In patch 7.1.5, Arms Warriors got a new honor talent called Storm of Destruction, which reduced Bladestorm's cooldown by 33%, and gave it an MS effect. For those of you who don't know what that means, it originally stood for Mortal Strike, as Mortal Strike was the ability that applied to healing debuff. Later on, they kind of converted that into the Mortal Wounds effect to streamline it, which applies a 25% healing reduction to the target. Then, much later on, in patch 7.2.5, the Anger Management talent was changed so that it would now also reduce the cooldown of Bladestorm. The bulk of changes to Bladestorm happened during Legion, but a couple of minor changes have happened since. During Battle for Azeroth, its duration was reduced from 6 seconds down to 4 seconds. Also, the tooltip was reverted to say the percentage damage per tick rather than overall like it did in Legion. Then later on in patch 8.1, its cooldown was decreased back to 1 minute from 1.5 minutes it was in Legion. Since it was heavily nerfed, it didn't really need the longer cooldown anymore. And most recently in Shadowlands, it was target capped at 8 targets. With the last 2 expansions of stat squishes, the calculations have been drastically changed for both Fury and Arms, but most notably is that Fury's Bladestorm generates 20 rage over the duration, that duration still being 4 seconds on a 1 minute cooldown, and remains a level 45 talent. While for Arms Warriors it doesn't generate rage, it's on a 1.5 minute cooldown, is learned at level 38, and lasts 6 seconds again like it did in BFA. It isn't used by Fury much outside of dungeons, but Arms use it quite often to burst people down in PvP. And if you're on a class with low movement, you better hope and pray that you can escape it, because you don't want to be caught in the Whirlwind of Death, or the Whirlwind of Tickling, since it doesn't hit as hard as it used to do in its original form. They really changed the ability from a feared single target nuke that also happened to be an AoE, to just an AoE you can use sometimes that might tickle a player in single target PvP situations. Okay, and that's it. Make sure to watch the playlist and all the other history videos.